Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Maskin. It's always great to be with you. So we're continuing our series, Be'ezras Hashem, this week of great Rebbeim and great Talmidim, and the interesting things that we can learn from their relationships with each other and what made them unique. So this week we're going to discuss, or this month I should say, we're going to discuss the relationship between the great Rav Nosson Adler and his Talmid, the Chassam Sofer, a very fascinating relationship on many levels. So we'll start by discussing a little bit about Rav Nosson Adler, then we'll talk a little bit about the Chassam Sofer, then we'll talk a little bit about their relationship with each other, and then hopefully we'll talk a little bit of Torah as well that came from Rav Nosson Adler through the Chassam Sofer. Rav Nosson Adler was a very interesting person in Jewish history. He was born in Frankfurt in 1741. He was a very precocious child. The Chida took a liking to him when he was a young child. He ultimately became a Talmid of the Pnei Yoshua and Talmid also of Rav David Tevel Shif, who was later the chief rabbi of the UK. He had no children, and he was offered a job at some point as the Rav of Metz, of a great city, Ir Ve'em B'Yisrael, but he turned it down. And the story goes that he's the one that encouraged the Shagas Aryeh to accept that position. He was a very learned in Kabbalah, and he did a lot of things that were highly unusual, that were very different in terms of Hanhagos. He pronounced Hebrew with a Sephardic pronunciation, even though he was Ashkenazi. He did Birchas Kohanim each and every day, even though he was living in Chutz La'aretz, which is also a Sephardic practice to do. His followers claimed that he had performed miracles all the time. The people at a certain point couldn't handle him anymore. At a certain point, they made a rule that he wasn't allowed to daven together with everybody else, that he could have his own minyan where he does his own things. He was trouble for a lot of people, because on the one hand, they all realized that he was an absolute kadosh v'tahor, that he was on a different level, that he was entirely of a different madrega than everybody else. But on the other hand, especially in a place like Frankfurt, where everyone's a good yeki, it became very difficult to have someone who was so different and who was doing things so differently, and everything was al pi Kabbalah, and his mysticism was something that was very hard for people to handle. His mysticism was probably also the reason that he didn't publish anything. He never really wrote any svarim. And as a result of that, we don't have pretty much all of the Torah that we have from Rav Nosson Adler is Torah that we have through his Talmud, through the. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, are you able to hear me? Is everyone able to hear me still?
Yes.
Okay, so most of the Torah that we have from him is in fact from his Talmud, the Chassam Sofer, because he didn't write anything. He wrote very tiny little notes that it's for himself almost. The Chassam Sofer is almost the opposite in terms of the way he was received by people. He's revered universally. He's especially revered by Hungarians. Rav Shachti used to tell us that if you speak to a Hungarian about the Chassam Sofer, or he used to say, if you speak to a Hungarian about the Vilna Gaon, they'll say, yeah, the Vilna Gaon was very great. He was almost as great as the Chassam Sofer. Meaning the Chassam Sofer was viewed as the Gadol Shebegadolim of all time. Chassam Sofer was born in 1766 and Frankfurt am Main, and at the age of 3. He was already asking questions that were causing his Malamed to have trouble answering. And that was his first introduction really to Rav Nosson Adler. The story goes that at the age of 3, his Melamed asked Rav Nosson Adler, "What do I do with this kid? He's so brilliant." And Rav Nosson Adler said, "You need to learn with him and focus a lot of attention on him because he's going to be Omid the Geduli. He's going to be someone who's going to be one of the greats." When he was 5 years old, he discovered that there was a machlokas about what bracha one is supposed to say over sugar, and he decided based on that, since there's a suffix brachos, he's never going to eat sugar again. He's never going to suck on sugar again, which was something that is not easy for a 5-year-old, particularly when there was no such thing as candies. And if you wanted anything sweet, that's all you could really have. At the age of 7, he finished learning Maseches Beitza, and he said his own chidushim on Maseches Beitza at the Siyum. Rav Nosson Adler was not his only Rebbe. His other Rebbe was Rav Pinchas Halevi Horowitz, who was known as the Hafla'ah, the author of the Hafla'ah. The Hafla'ah was a great influence, a profound influence on his life. But in fact, in one place, I couldn't find it, I couldn't locate it, but I seem to recall in one place, the Chassam Sofer describes what it was like watching, the Hafla'ah was a Levi, Pinchas Levi Ish Horowitz. The Hafla'ah was a Levi, and Rav Nosson Adler was a Kohen. In one place, the Chassam Sofer describes watching the Hafla'ah wash the hands of Rav Nosson Adler before Birchas Kohanim. And if you were to hear a description of someone describing Kabbalas HaTorah itself, it probably would not be in such glowing terms as the Chassam Sofer describing his 2 Rebbeim, interacting with each other. For 7 years, the Chassam Sofer was supported by his brother-in-law after he got married, his brother-in-law Rav Hirsch, and he devoted himself totally to learning Torah. And then his brother-in-law lost all of his money. And his wife, at some point, they got so desperate, his wife had to sell her headscarf, her head covering, to buy wine for Kiddush. And he decided at that point, it's time to take a Rabbanus, which he was not interested in doing. And he took the Rabbanus of a city called Dresnitz. Afterward, at some point, his brother-in-law got back on his feet again. And his brother-in-law said, now I understand why I lost all my money. I lost my money so that you could be forced to take a Rabbanus, because that's what you were destined to do the whole time, and you were just refusing to do it. So Hashem had to force your hand. He then ultimately became the Rav of Pressburg, where after Rav Meshul Migra passed away, and that's where the Chassam Sofer was Rav for 33 years, and that's where he fought his major battles against the Maskilim. And that's also where his name became known far and wide, and he became known as a posek, where people sent him shilas throughout the world. He battled the reform. The tagline of the Chassam Sofer was Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. That was like his mantra, that anything new, any new anhagos, any new practices are all asur. We have to be traditional. That's why the Chassam Sofer didn't allow weddings in a shul, not in a reform, in an Orthodox shul, because he held that that comes from non-Jews, other religions have their weddings in places of worship, and therefore he asked weddings in shuls. There are some poskim that will only go to a wedding in a conservative or reform shul and not in an Orthodox shul, because they're worried about the Chassam Sofer. They're not worried about the concerns of going into a reform or conservative shul. They're worried about the Chassam Sofer, and they say, okay, reform conservative shul, the Chassam Sofer never would have called the Beis HaKnesses, but to actually go have a wedding in a shul was something that to this day there are descendants of the Chassam Sofer and spiritual descendants of the Chassam Sofer that are careful about that. And that was all because of this Chadash Asur Min HaTorah and the concern that the reformers were doing everything to imitate the non-Jews in their method of worship. He also was extremely knowledgeable of secular sciences, astronomy and geometry and history. He was extremely knowledgeable. He was but primarily a very great tzaddik. In addition to being a great Talmid Chacham, the Chassam Sofer, when he was Rav in Mattersdorf, he was actually planning on leaving to a different city, but then a fire broke out and almost every house except for his burnt down. They worked very hard to save his house because a lot of people gave him their money as a pikadon to hold on to because they knew that they could trust him. So everyone's valuables were in the Chassam Sofer's house. So they worked very hard to save his house. Everything else burnt down, and he felt that he had to stay to take care of the people. And while others were suffering,
so long as other people didn't have a bed to sleep in, he would not sleep in the bed. He gave almost everything he had to help other people. There were times that he couldn't afford the paper on which to write his Chidushei Torah because he was so focused on helping other people. His children write about him. Rav Shimon Sofer writes that his father said three things about himself, that from the day he was Ola L'Gedula, Ola L'Das, he never had any foreign thoughts during his tefillah. He was always totally focused on his tefillah. How many of us make it through a couple of brachos of tefillah without having a foreign thought in our tefillah? Just absolutely remarkable. Some Sofer said about himself, according to Rav Shimon Sofer, that he never felt any sense of arrogance, any sense of pride in his own chidushim, except in his first drasha in Dresnitz, and that was just to show that he could learn, so that people should have covered rabbanos. And he said that the third thing, that he always ran his house and his community with absolute integrity and everything l'shem shamayim, dignity, integrity, 100% l'shem shamayim. At some point, he writes, he was so busy with all of his different involvements. A lot of times when we deal with these, you look at these Gedolei Torah and you think they must have been learning all day and all night and never had time to do any chesed, never had time to run their communities and their yeshivas. Chassam Sofer was Rosh Yeshiva of one of the largest yeshivas in the world. Everyone was clamoring to learn by the Chassam Sofer. One of his conditions in accepting a rabbanos was that you had to, the city had to support his yeshiva. He had hundreds of talmidim. He was engaged in chesed to an incredible degree. In one of his shuvas, he writes that he's so busy that he doesn't have time to swallow his own saliva. Now, one would imagine that that's an exaggeration, but still, I don't even know how one comes up with such an expression, to even think of that as something that one needs time to do. But he was so harried and he was so busy with everything. And he published so much Torah, again, in contrast to his Rebbe. He published his Chidushim on Chumash, the Chassam Sofer on Chumash, the Torah Moshe on Chumash, his Chidushim on Shas, his Shalos and Shuvas. Rav Shachman told us that the Chassam Sofer used to write his Shalos and Shuvas between Mincha and Mariv. It was something like he did Kila Achar Yad. It was like, a Shaila came in and you just quickly jot down the tshuva, and it's a classic. The Shalos Shuvas Chassam Sofer is quoted on every page of Pischei Tshuva in Yeridea. It's a classic, and it was like something that he just did. It's just that he happened to do. He happened to have been writing when he had a little bit of extra time. His drashos are classics. He was an Adam Gadol Ad Ma'od. He also produced very, very great Talmidim. Obviously, most notably, probably the Ksav Sofer. After his first wife died, the Chassam Sofer married the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, which is a little bit interesting in the sense that he was Rabbi Akiva Eiger's son-in-law, but there was only a 2-year age gap between the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eiger. His own father-in-law was only 2 years older than him. So it's a lot of
I saw open.
Ask everyone to mute. There's one person to mute. If there's a lot of tshuvas back and forth between the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and they speak reverentially about each other. And the reason his wife was so much younger than him was because it was his second wife. So in his second marriage, he married the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. His first wife was childless. I don't think he had any children from his first wife, but the Rabbi Akiva Eiger's daughter, the Chassam Sofer had 10 children with. He had 7 daughters and 3 sons. So the Ksav Sofer was one of those sons, as was Rav Shimon Sofer. Ksav Sofer was Rav Avram Shmuel Binyamin Sofer. Rav Shimon Sofer was the Rav of Krakow. Rav Yosef Yuspa Sofer was another one, a third son. He had all of his descendants are Rabbi Akiva Eiger descendants of the Chassam Sofer. So when someone says they descend from the Chassam Sofer, they usually descend from Rabbi Akiva Eiger as well. There was a great Rav in Krakow, the last Rav of Krakow, actually, I think before the war, maybe the second last Rav, Rav Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer, was a great grandson of the Chassam Sofer on both his mother's and his father's side. Rav Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer wrote Chidushim, and his parents were first cousins. They were both descendants of the Chassam Sofer. You cannot get a page of Rav Yosef Nechemia Kornitzer's Chidushim without quoting the Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer was everything to him. In Pressburg, his main efforts, where he was the Rav for so many decades, was really on expanding his yeshiva, and fighting against the reform. And most of his students, many of his students, became the major leaders in communities throughout Europe. So major Gedolei Torah who were abundant, that were leading European Jewry in that generation, were almost all Talmidim of the Chassam Sofer. He also was a tremendous Ohev Eretz Yisrael. The Chassam Sofer had this incredible love of Eretz Yisrael. He was a big supporter of the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. With regard to those Jews who thought the emancipation of Jews in Europe was a lessening of the need to return to Zion, he would give a mashal. There were people that thought, oh, okay, if Jews are emancipated and we can live a comfortable life in Europe, so there's no desperation to get to Eretz Yisrael. So Chassam Sofer gave a mashal of a prince who was sent away from his father's palace, and as years went by, he never lost hope that his father would one day call him back to the palace. But one day a royal wagon arrived, and a team of architects and workers jumped out of the wagon and began building a beautiful mansion for the prince where he was in his remote village. And the prince realized that he's in real trouble now, because if his father sent these people to build him a beautiful house where he is, it means that his father's not calling him back, that he doesn't want him back so quickly. So he said, you shouldn't be pleased with the emancipation in Europe. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu telling us that he's not bringing us back. He's not bringing us where we belong. We should be more desperate to come back to Eretz Yisrael. He was the president of Kol Shomrei Chomos of Meir Balanes, and he worked very hard for the Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, always trying to get people to contribute. But back to his relationship with Rav Nosson Adler, he was in total awe of his Rebbe. There are many, many places in the Chuvas Chassam Sofer where he quotes his Rebbe, and you could see just the absolute reverence. And it's so interesting because no one knew what to do with Rav Nosson Adler. The Chassam Sofer, everyone knew what to do with. The Chassam Sofer was a leader of major communities and major yeshivas. The Rav Nosson Adler, they had to marginalize and put him in a room where he could just have his own minion. All his hanhagos were al pi Kabbalah. Chassam Sofer, none of his hanhagos were al pi Kabbalah. Chassam Sofer's hanhagos were all normal. They were all mainstream. He would never allow the hanhagos of Rav Nosson Adler to be practiced in public, despite his tremendous awe and his belief that Rav Nosson Adler was never wrong about anything. It's fascinating. When Rav Shechter told us the story all the time, that when the Chassam Sofer was 10 years old, that was his first real interaction with Rav Nosson Adler that changed his life forever. He was giving a drasha in Rav Nosson Adler's Beis Medrash, and many of the biggest Talmidei Chacham of Frankfurt were there, and he argued on the Marshach. The Marshach was the Chassam Sofer's grandfather. So Chassam Sofer, as a 10-year-old, quoted a chiddush of his grandfather and argued on him. So the Chassam Sofer's father was upset with his son. How could you publicly disagree with the Zayda? So the father came and slapped his son across the face. Chutzpah that you disagree with the Zayda. Rav Nosson Adler saw that, and he said, this father is going to stifle the child's growth. This child is a genius, and he can't be stifled like that. And he pulled the father aside, and he said, I'm being mitzvah you that you have to leave your son in my care. I have to take care of him. I have to learn with him. I have to teach him. And he essentially, I say this in the nicest possible way, kidnapped the Chassam Sofer and raised him as his own child from then on. Something that could not happen now. One would hope could not happen nowadays, but that really changed the Chassam Sofer's life forever. He became very knowledgeable, obviously, in Torah and Kabbalah and all that from being with Rav Nosson Adler. There were a lot of people that didn't like Rav Nosson Adler, as we mentioned before. So he was thrown out of the community, and at a certain point, he had to become a rav in a city called Baskovich. And as he left, there were some people that were leaving, that were escorting him. And the Chassam Sofer said, I would want to go to Baskovich to be Meshamish, the Rebbe. And then he realized that he didn't say B'li Neder. So he asked Rav Nosson Adler, what I just said, was that a neder? And Rav Nosson Adler said, yes, that counts as a neder. So he tried to jump onto the wagon, but there was no room for him. And he was desperate to fulfill the neder. So he chased after the wagon for miles until he caught up at a crossroads. And Rav Nosson Adler made a place for him in the wagon and took him along with him to Baskovich, where he was the rav for a short time. Which is, again, these we can't even relate to these stories of the kind of relationship that he had. In many of his writings, he refers to Rav Nosson Adler in the most glowing terms. So let's do a little bit of Torah that the Chassam Sofer had from Rav Nosson Adler. Maybe it happens to be that I was searching this topic about Torah, so I googled Rav Nosson Adler Chassam Sofer, see what would come up, and what came up was an article that someone wrote about Nittelnacht, which is coming up next week, about the night of Christmas, where there's a minhag that some have not to learn Torah on that night. So there was an article, and as I was reading the article, I'm like, this looks so familiar to me. And then I got to the end of the article, and it said, taken from Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz. I'm like, oh, okay, that's why it looks familiar. I forgot that I wrote an article about this topic. So sometimes you need other people to remind you. So the Chassam Sofer quotes from Nosson Adler that the reason not to learn Torah on Nittelnacht was because we're in a state of Avelus, that a mourner is not allowed to learn Torah during Shiva. So the birth that the Christians celebrate on that day has been the source of so many troubles for the Jewish people over the centuries. I was just giving a shir this morning in Washington Heights in the Mount Sinai Jewish Center about the halachos of this time of year. And, people often ask, can I just say Merry Christmas to my coworkers? Am I allowed to say something like that? Is it leaving the halacha aside, whether you should or shouldn't? If you have any sense of the history of this day for the Jewish people and what that meant for the Jewish people, I said, imagine, and maybe this is an extreme way to put it, but imagine a couple of hundred years from now, there were people walking around saying Happy Nazi Day, or something like that, or Happy Holocaust, or if you have any sense of the kind of grief and persecution that came about as a result of this day, I think a Jew should cringe, when before saying something like that, before wishing a Merry Christmas to somebody else. But anyway, it was a day of so that's what Nosson Adler picks up on. That it was a day of great mourning for the Jewish people, and one of the ways that we experience Avelus is by not learning Torah. Chassam Sofer says something different. He says that Christians would get up at midnight to attend midnight mass, and the rabbis were faced with a dilemma, because if all the Jews were sleeping at the time that the non-Jews were running with great zihirus and zrizus toward their religious service, so that would be a big kitrug on Klal Yisrael. It would look like the Jews aren't doing anything. On the other hand, the Rabbanim didn't want to institute a rule that people should wake up at midnight to learn Torah, because then it would look like we're mimicking a non-Jewish practice. It would look like we're copying them. So the solution was to enact a decree against Torah study during the first half of the night, and the result of that would be that we would learn Torah during the second half of the night. So we'd learn Torah throughout the first half of the evening, and then I think it was not to learn the first half of the evening, so that we'd wake up in order to learn from midnight and on whatever we normally would have learned during the night seder in the first half of the evening. And that's when the non-Jews were running toward their midnight mass. So many Jews were able to engage in Torah study at that time. Another important teaching or interesting teaching, there are a lot of halachic teachings, which maybe we'll have time to get to or maybe not, but an interesting teaching of Rav Nosson Adler that Chassam Sofer sort of took one step further and built upon is a discussion about Hakel. Once every 7 years, all the Jews would gather to hear the king read the Torah, and even young children had to be present. Nashim B'taf, and the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka and Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma were greeting Rabbi Yeshua once, and they said, "No, what chiddush did you learn in the Beis Medrash today?" And they said, "Oh, you're the Rebbe. We want to hear what you have to say." So he said, "Yeah, but ain't Beis Medrash below chiddush, so it must be that you have some chiddush to tell me." So he said, "Yeah, we did hear one chiddush. We heard a chiddush from Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah that when it says that Hakel is Nashim B'taf, that why is it that we bring the children?" So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said that the men and the women come to learn and the shema and to listen, and the children come lavi schar l'mevi'ehem, to give schar to those who bring them. So Rabbi Yeshua said, "Ooh, such a margalas tova, such a precious pearl, and you weren't going to tell me. I had to bait you to say it. I had to pull it out of you." So it's a little bit interesting. What exactly is that teaching us? That we bring the children for no reason whatsoever? Why is there any reward for bringing the children if there's no inherent value in bringing the children? So Rav Nosson Adler is quoted in the sefer called Shar Naftali, on Parshas Vayelech, that there was an important lesson at Hakel. When children are there, they tend to be a distraction. In shul, very often children are a distraction. They're making noise, or they need to be entertained, or they drop their sitter or whatever, their lollipop or something like that. So if you really, really want to be focused, it's much smarter to leave children, in groups or with a babysitter or something like that if you want to concentrate. But the Torah wants to tell us that it's worthwhile to have a few distractions and even limit yourself sometimes in order to help other people. And that's what Avraham Avinu did when he taught other people Torah. He didn't seclude himself. I'm sure he would have accomplished great spiritual heights had he done so. But our perfection sometimes comes from opening up ourselves to slight imperfection, to allowing others to distract us sometimes. So in order to be able to help them, in order to be able to teach them, so yeah, they may demand, our attention at times, but that's what it is. That's what life is. You balance these things, and that's what the limud was, says Rav Nosson Adler, that the children were worth it. It was worth bringing the children because you want to be mechanic the children. You want to have access to your children at all times and give them the experience of being in the presence of such kedusha. So the another Rebbe of the Chassam Sofer, the Hafla'a, took it in a little bit of a different direction. The Hafla'a in Panim Yafo says that the difference between human beings and malachim is that humans are made imperfect and we have to grow. Malachim are omdim. Malachim stand in one place. Humans always need to be striving to do better. The Hafla'a said that's why the Gemara says in Maseches Moed Katan and in Maseches Chagiga that if the Rebbe is dom and the Malach Hashem Tzvakos Yivakish Torah Mipiv. What does it mean? If the Rebbe is dom and the Malach Hashem Tzvakos, the Rebbe is like a Malach, you should learn from him. I actually heard this. Rav Shechter told us that Rav Pam said this vart at the Levaya of Rebbetzin Shechter's father. Rebbetzin Shechter's father, Rav Shapiro, was Rebbe in Tarvadas, and Rav Pam was maspid at his Levaya, and he said this vart. He said, why is it that you want your Rebbe to be like a Malach Hashem Tzvakos? He says this, because a Malach Hashem doesn't move. A Malach Hashem stays in one place. And very often a Rebbe feels like he needs to say new Chidushim all the time, and it's his 10th time learning Bava Kama, so he's going to pick up from where he left off last time. But it's the Talmidim's first time learning Bava Kama. They don't yet know what a tam and a muad is. They don't know the basics of the. So the Rebbe is going to be saying on whatever level he's at. That's not helpful for the Talmidim. For the Talmidim, the Rebbe has to be like a Malach Hashem. He has to stand in one place. He can't always be advancing, and he has to explain the basics in order for the Talmidim to understand. So a similar idea to what Rav Nosson Adler is saying. You need to hold yourself back a little bit sometimes if you're going to help other people. So the Chassam Sofer took this one step further. The Chassam Sofer in Torah Moshe to Parshas Kedoshim points out that the Gemara in Bamidbar Dasan Beis has a machlokas ben Petur and Rabbi Akiva, that if two people are walking in a desert and there's only enough water for one of them, so Ben Petura says that the person who has the water should share the water and they'll both die, rather than save your own life at the other guy's expense. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, chayecha kodmin, your life comes before somebody else's life. So the person who has the water should drink it himself and save his own life, even at the expense of somebody else. So what about what does that mean? If you're always going to save yourself first, some Sofer says that's what Rabbi Kiva means when Rabbi Kiva says in the 9th parak of the Yerushalmi, in the 9th parak of Nedarim, that Zek Klal Gadol Batorah, V'aftal L'reach Kamocha Zek Klal Gadol Batorah. Rabbi Kiva wanted us to know that by loving other people as you love yourself and caring for his well-being, it's not exactly the same in the physical world. As it is in the spiritual world. When it comes to Torah, you have to sacrifice your own growth for other people. But when it comes to the physical world, you're not supposed to sacrifice yourself for other people. You're supposed to chayecha kodmin in terms of the water that you're supposed to drink. But when it comes to Torah, that a person has to give up of their time and give up of their energy and give up of their own personal growth in order to help other people. There's this concept of hu haya omer. Sometimes someone says a Dvar Torah, and it's not just a Dvar Torah, but it's an autobiographical Dvar Torah. It's a description of the self. So the Chassam Sofer was thinking in these terms. Chassam Sofer was thinking in terms of giving up of oneself. He was a super genius. He was someone who people were asking shalos throughout the world, and he dedicated himself to helping his talmidim, hundreds of talmidim. He dedicated himself to doing chesed. How much of his time, of his precious time, did he give up to do things like that? And he did it because that's one's avoda. Rebbe is supposed to be like a Malach Hashem, and to a great extent, he probably learned that from Rav Nassan Adler. Rav Nassan Adler adopted him. He brought him into his home. He raised him. And that's something that, granted, the circumstances around the adoption are somewhat odd by certainly when judged by modern standards. But he saw someone who was willing to give up so much of himself in order to raise the next generation. And think about what Rav Nassan Adler's contribution would have been had there never been a Chassam Sofer. It would have come and gone and no one ever would have known anything about it because he never wrote. He never wrote anything. But because he produced the Chassam Sofer, so and the Chassam Sofer in turn produced the Maram Shik and the Ksav Sofer and hundreds of other Talmidim. So you see, that ultimately became his greatest impact. So Bez Hashem, next month when we get together, we'll discuss different Rebbe Talmud connection. But this was a little bit about Rav Nassan Adler and the Chassam Sofer. I wish everyone a wonderful day and a wonderful month.
I want to thank Rabbi Leibowitz again for a fantastic shir. Rabbi Leibowitz, just please stay on for 2 seconds afterwards.
Okay.
Everybody should have a wonderful day.
Have a great day. Take care. Shavua Tov.
Good.
And Mazel Tov.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Rabbi, looking forward to your visit. Tell me, is your wife coming with you?
I think so, yes. I think she is.
Okay. So she's planning on coming. So you didn't buy tickets yet, right?
I did not buy tickets yet because I was not sure where I was going to be coming from.
Okay.
Because I was supposed to be in Israel that week and fly straight from Tel Aviv to Los Angeles on Wednesday night. But it looks like that will not happen.
Okay, right. When do you want to come? And when do you want to leave? And I can give you a credit card and you can purchase accordingly.
Oh, great. Okay. Let me speak to my wife. I think we want to leave Sunday night. When do I want to come? Probably sometime on Thursday. We'll probably, and then we'll leave Los Angeles Sunday night. Spend the day there Sunday.
Okay. My wife may very well not be here. I don't think she will. We'll work everything out. My daughter in Englewood, Daniel's the associate rabbi in Englewood.
Yeah, sure.
So my daughter, my youngest daughter, Dina, is his wife, and they're expecting their number 3.
Oh, wow. Very nice.
Yeah, they're expecting number 3, and it's 10. So when we planned this, we didn't realize that. But we'll work everything out. It doesn't matter. But you just let me know. Should you want me to give you the credit card and the shul's credit card, and you just want to buy the tickets? How would you like to do this? You want to speak to your wife? You want to get back to me?
Let me get back to you. Let me speak to my wife and get back to you.
Okay, and then I'll let you choose whatever is best for you and just put it on the credit card.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
How does that sound? That sounds good?
Yeah.
Okay, I know Jason told me that you're going to give a shir in his shul on Sunday morning. That's fine.
He asked me.
Yeah, no, he asked me. I said, that's fine. Lama. Okay, so you let me know and I'll get you the credit card.
Thank you so much.
Really Not at all. Yashikah. Thanks loads. I was, by the way, in the cemetery in Frankfurt many, many years ago where the Haflah is buried.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nassan Adler supposedly is buried there too.
Right.
But they're not really sure if those graves, that's a whole different interesting question, But the Frankfurt Beis HaKfaros, the old Frankfurt Beis HaKfaros, is literally at the end of the street, of the Jewish street.
Really?
It's fascinating. It wasn't, outside of the Machana.
Wow.
The end of, the Judengasse. It's interesting.
Wow.
I was many, many years ago. But anyhow, yeah, a big yeshakayach.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.